When Jessica Martinez caught Tyler Brennan's wrist mid-swing, the 17-year-old football star suddenly understood what 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught her about leverage and pressure points. The keys to her Jeep Wrangler dropped from his other hand as his knees buckled, and the smirk that had been plastered across his face since he'd cornered her in the Riverside High parking lot vanished entirely. His 2 accomplices, Jake Morrison and Chad Sullivan, froze as they watched their seemingly invincible leader reduced to a whimpering mess by the new PE teacher they'd assumed would be an easy target. What happened next would expose a culture of unchecked bullying that had poisoned Millbrook, Oregon's most celebrated high school for years, but it would also reveal that some people fight back harder than others expect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, Jessica Martinez had pulled into the Riverside High faculty parking lot for the first time, her military duffel bag and a box of teaching supplies filling the back of her Jeep. At 28, she was starting over in ways she'd never imagined when she'd enlisted fresh out of high school. The Army had given her purpose, structure, and skills she'd never thought she'd need in civilian life. 3 deployments as a combat engineer had taught her to defuse explosive situations both literally and figuratively. But nothing in her military training had prepared her for the particular challenges of American public education. Millbrook was supposed to be a fresh start. After her discharge 6 months ago, Jess had spent weeks applying for teaching positions across the Pacific Northwest, drawn to the idea of making a positive impact on young lives. The town of 45,000, nestled in Oregon's Willamette Valley, seemed perfect. A blend of working-class families and transplants from Portland seeking affordable housing and good schools. Riverside High served nearly 2,000 students from diverse backgrounds, and the job posting for a PE and health teacher had emphasized their commitment to building character through athletics. Principal Robert Wilson had been enthusiastic during her interview, particularly impressed by her military background and her degree in exercise science from Oregon State. He'd spoken passionately about Riverside's championship sports programs and their need for someone who could bring discipline and structure to their physical education department. The previous teacher had retired suddenly mid-semester, leaving behind a program that Wilson described diplomatically as needing fresh energy and direction. What Wilson hadn't mentioned was the deeply entrenched hierarchy that placed student athletes, particularly football players, above accountability. Jess discovered this reality during her first week when she assigned fitness assessments to all her classes. She designed the tests based on military standards, modified appropriately for teenagers, expecting some grumbling but general compliance. Instead, she encountered something she hadn't experienced since basic training: open defiance from students who seemed genuinely shocked that anyone would expect them to follow rules. Tyler Brennan had been the most vocal in his resistance. The senior quarterback stood 6 feet tall and carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd never faced consequences for his actions. When Jess explained that his failure to complete the assessment would result in a failing grade for the week, he'd laughed openly and suggested she speak to Coach Patterson about special accommodations for varsity athletes. His teammates Jake Morrison and Chad Sullivan had joined in the laughter, creating a disruption that derailed the entire class period. That afternoon, Jess had indeed spoken to Coach Rick Patterson, hoping to clarify the school's policies regarding academic requirements for athletes. She'd found the 52-year-old athletic director in his office, surrounded by trophy cases and photographs spanning 2 decades of championship teams. Patterson had listened to her concerns with the practiced patience of someone managing an inconvenience, then explained the realities of coaching high school sports in a competitive district. Riverside's football program generated significant revenue for the school district through ticket sales, concessions, and booster club donations. The basketball and wrestling teams also contributed to the school's reputation and funding. These programs, Patterson had explained, required flexibility from academic staff to ensure student-athletes could balance their commitments. Previous teachers had understood this arrangement and found ways to accommodate the special needs of high-performing students. The conversation had left Jess feeling unsettled but determined to find middle ground. She'd modified her approach, offering alternative assessment methods and flexible scheduling for athletes with legitimate conflicts. However, Tyler and his circle seemed to interpret her accommodation as weakness, rather than professionalism. They began testing boundaries in increasingly obvious ways, arriving late to class, disrupting instruction, and treating her gymnasium as their personal domain during scheduled PE periods. The situation escalated when Jess assigned a health unit on bullying prevention and conflict resolution. The curriculum, mandated by the state, required students to examine power dynamics in school environments and develop strategies for intervention when witnessing harassment. Tyler had objected loudly to what he called liberal propaganda, claiming that teaching students to report on their peers would destroy team unity and school spirit. His disruption during the lesson had been so severe that Jess had been forced to send him to the office, her first disciplinary referral since starting at Riverside. Principal Wilson had met with Tyler that same day, but the conversation had apparently focused more on maintaining his eligibility for the upcoming playoffs than addressing his classroom behavior. When Tyler returned to class the following day, he'd been superficially compliant but radiated resentment that made other students uncomfortable. Jess had noticed several quieter students seemed afraid to participate in discussions when Tyler was present, creating an atmosphere of tension that undermined the learning environment she was trying to establish. The breaking point had come when Emma Chen, a junior student council member, approached Jess after class with a troubling report. Emma had witnessed Tyler and his friends cornering younger students in the locker rooms and equipment storage areas, demanding money for what they called protection services. The harassment had been ongoing for months, targeting students who couldn't fight back and had no social support systems. Emma had tried reporting the incidents through proper channels, but her complaints had been dismissed as misunderstandings or typical teenage drama. Emma had tried reporting and had been collecting evidence for 3 months before she finally approached Jessica Martinez. The junior student council member kept detailed notes in a composition notebook she hid beneath her trigonometry textbook, documenting incidents that the administration consistently overlooked or dismissed. Her careful handwriting recorded dates, times, locations, and witnesses to what had become a systematic campaign of intimidation targeting the most vulnerable students at Riverside High. The pattern had become clear to Emma during her sophomore year, when she'd watched Tyler Brennan and his circle perfect their methods of extracting money from freshmen and transfer students. They'd identified students who lacked social connections, those whose parents worked multiple jobs and couldn't attend school events, kids who qualified for free lunch programs and couldn't afford to lose the small amounts of cash they carried for emergencies. The football players had developed an elaborate protection racket, disguised as school tradition, claiming they were collecting voluntary contributions for team spirit activities while making it clear that refusal would result in daily harassment. Marcus Webb had been one of their first targets when he'd transferred from Portland halfway through his freshman year. The quiet 15-year-old had struggled to make friends and spent most lunches reading in the library to avoid the social dynamics of the cafeteria. Tyler had approached him during his second week at Riverside, explaining with apparent friendliness that new students traditionally contributed $20 monthly to support school athletics. When Marcus had politely explained that his mother worked 2 jobs to pay rent and he didn't have extra money, Tyler's demeanor had shifted dramatically. The harassment had begun subtly, with books knocked from Marcus's hands in hallways and his backpack occasionally emptied in busy corridors. When he'd tried to report these incidents, administrators had suggested he was having difficulty adjusting to a new school environment and recommended he join clubs or sports teams to make friends. The suggestion that he should try out for junior varsity football had been delivered with straight faces, despite Marcus weighing barely 130 pounds and showing no athletic inclination whatsoever. As weeks passed, the intimidation had escalated to include deliberate spills in the cafeteria that soaked his homework and textbooks, strategic blocking in hallways that made him late for classes, and whispered threats during passing periods when teachers couldn't overhear. Marcus had endured the treatment for 2 months before his mother noticed his declining grades and increasingly withdrawn behavior. When she'd scheduled a conference with Principal Wilson, Marcus had begged her not to mention the bullying, terrified that official complaints would make his situation worse. The meeting had accomplished nothing productive. Wilson had acknowledged that Marcus seemed to be struggling with his transition, but emphasized that Riverside High had a zero-tolerance policy for bullying and harassment. He'd assured Marcus's mother that such behavior wouldn't be tolerated if reported through proper channels, while simultaneously suggesting that teenage social dynamics could be complex, and sometimes students misinterpreted normal peer interactions as hostile when they were feeling insecure or overwhelmed. Similar scenarios had played out with other students throughout Emma's sophomore and junior years. Alex Rodriguez had been targeted for his participation in drama club, with Tyler's group questioning his masculinity and spreading rumors about his sexual orientation until he'd quit the theater program entirely. Melissa Park had faced constant criticism of her appearance and academic achievements, with Tyler and his friends loudly discussing her alleged use of performance-enhancing drugs to explain her honor roll status. When she'd tried to defend herself, they'd escalated to claiming she was cheating on exams and should be investigated for academic dishonesty. The administration's response had been consistently inadequate, following a pattern that Emma had begun to recognize as deliberate. Initial complaints were treated as personality conflicts or misunderstandings that could be resolved through mediation sessions that somehow never materialized. When harassment continued and victims insisted on formal investigations, the process became so bureaucratic and invasive that most students preferred to endure the abuse rather than subject themselves to administrative scrutiny. Danny Rodriguez, the school's IT specialist and Navy veteran, had witnessed much of this dysfunction during his 2 years at Riverside. His position gave him access to email communications between staff members, and he'd noticed concerning patterns in how bullying reports were handled. Complaints involving Tyler Brennan or other prominent athletes were routinely downgraded from harassment to interpersonal conflicts, while similar incidents involving non-athletes received immediate attention and consequences. The disparity had become so obvious that Danny had preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Begun documenting the differential treatment, maintaining unofficial records that painted a disturbing picture of institutional bias. He'd observed administrators coaching Tyler through the complaint process, providing him with talking points that reframed his aggressive behavior as misunderstood leadership or competitive spirit channeled inappropriately. Meanwhile, his victims received lectures about resilience, conflict resolution, and the importance of not letting personality differences disrupt their education. Maria Santos, the school counselor, had tried repeatedly to address these systemic issues through proper channels. Her background in social work had trained her to recognize patterns of institutional failure that enabled abusive behavior, and she'd documented numerous cases where administrative responses had actually worsened situations for vulnerable students. Her attempts to implement evidence-based bullying prevention programs had been consistently blocked or delayed, with budget constraints and scheduling conflicts cited as insurmountable obstacles. The counselor had grown increasingly frustrated watching talented students transfer to other schools or withdraw from activities they loved because of harassment they couldn't escape. She'd seen Marcus Webb's grades plummet despite his obvious intelligence, watched Alex Rodriguez abandon his passion for theater, and observed Melissa Park develop anxiety symptoms that required medical intervention. Each case represented a failure of the school's fundamental obligation to provide a safe learning environment for all students. When Emma had finally decided to approach Jessica Martinez with her documentation, she'd been motivated by desperation rather than hope. 3 years of watching the pattern repeat itself had convinced her that adult intervention through normal channels was pointless, but something about the new PE teacher suggested she might respond differently to evidence of systematic abuse. Perhaps it was her military background or her obvious discomfort with Tyler's classroom disruptions, but Emma sensed that Jessica might actually prioritize student welfare over athletic program politics. The decision to trust Jessica with her carefully collected evidence felt enormous to Emma, who had watched previous attempts at justice fail spectacularly. She'd seen other students who'd tried to challenge the established order face retaliation that made their original harassment seem mild by comparison. But the alternative was accepting that Riverside High would continue operating as Tyler Brennan's personal kingdom, where vulnerable students existed solely to finance his sense of superiority and demonstrate his power over those who couldn't fight back. The evidence Emma Chen presented to Jessica painted a picture far more disturbing than isolated incidents of teenage cruelty. As Jessica reviewed the composition notebook filled with dates, locations, and detailed accounts, she began recognizing a sophisticated operation that had been perfected over several years. The harassment wasn't random teenage aggression, but a calculated system designed to extract money while maintaining plausible deniability through careful manipulation of school policies and administrative blind spots. Sarah Kim had been Tyler's most profitable target during the previous academic year. The quiet senior had worked afternoons at her family's restaurant to help pay for college application fees, and had foolishly mentioned having cash for her driver's license renewal during a conversation Tyler had overheard. Within days, she'd been approached by Jake Morrison, who'd explained that seniors traditionally contributed $50 to fund the football team's playoff celebration. When Sarah had explained she couldn't afford such an amount, Jake had suggested she could pay in installments while Tyler happened to walk past and offer his enthusiastic support for the payment plan. The weekly collections had continued throughout Sarah's senior year, with amounts fluctuating based on her perceived ability to pay. When she'd missed a bean payment due to reduced hours at the restaurant, her locker had been vandalized with permanent marker, and her textbooks had disappeared from her PE locker during class. The replacement costs had exceeded her missed payment, creating a cycle where she'd fallen further behind while trying to catch up on both the original demands and the punishment fees Tyler's group had instituted for late payments. Sarah's parents had immigrated from South Korea when she was young, working 16-hour days to establish their restaurant business while struggling with limited English proficiency. Their daughter's academic success represented everything they'd sacrificed to achieve, and they'd trusted the American education system to provide the opportunities they'd sought. When Sarah's grades had begun declining during her senior year, they'd attributed the change to college application stress and had encouraged her to work harder rather than investigating external factors affecting her performance. The isolation had been intentional and methodical. Tyler's group had identified students whose families were either too busy, too trusting, or too intimidated by institutional authority to investigate problems their children faced at school. Recent immigrants, single-parent households, and families where parents worked multiple jobs became primary targets because their children understood that involving adults would likely create additional complications rather than solutions. Kevin Torres had learned this lesson during his junior year when his mother had attempted to address the harassment her son faced after refusing to pay what Tyler called membership dues for accessing the weight room during lunch periods. The meeting with Principal Wilson had resulted in Kevin being assigned to supervise study hall during lunch instead of being allowed free access to school facilities, effectively punishing him for the complaint, while appearing to address the conflict through administrative action. The supervised study hall had been presented as a neutral solution that would prevent further conflicts between Kevin and other students using the weight room. However, the arrangement had eliminated Kevin's only opportunity for the strength training his doctor had recommended for a chronic back condition, while simultaneously marking him as someone who'd involved parents in school disputes. The social stigma had made his situation worse rather than better, demonstrating to other potential victims that official complaints would backfire spectacularly. Jessica had begun recognizing similar patterns in her own interactions with the administrative staff. When she'd submitted her first disciplinary referral for Tyler's classroom disruption, Vice Principal Linda Thompson had scheduled a meeting that focused more on Jessica's classroom management techniques than on Tyler's behavior. Thompson had suggested that military-style instruction might not translate effectively to civilian educational environments, and had recommended several workshops on positive reinforcement strategies for managing challenging students. The workshops had been scheduled during Jessica's planning periods, effectively reducing her preparation time while requiring her to attend training sessions on techniques she'd already mastered during her teacher preparation program. When she'd pointed out that her military background had included extensive experience managing diverse groups under stressful conditions, Thompson had responded with condescending observations about the differences between commanding soldiers and educating adolescents who chose to attend school rather than being compelled by military orders. Similar deflection tactics had been used with other teachers who'd attempted to address Tyler's group's behavior. Mr. Anderson, who taught honors biology, had reported multiple instances of academic intimidation where Tyler and his friends had demanded answers during exams and had disrupted lab procedures when other students outperformed them. The response had been a suggestion that Anderson might benefit from professional development on collaborative learning strategies that would help high-achieving athletes feel more engaged in academic environments. The pattern extended beyond individual teachers to encompass systematic manipulation of school policies that should have protected vulnerable students. The anonymous reporting system that was supposed to allow students to report harassment without fear of retaliation had been compromised by Tyler's group, who discovered that reports were reviewed by Coach Patterson before being forwarded to administration. Students who'd submitted anonymous complaints had found themselves facing unexpected scrutiny of their own behavior, with minor infractions that had previously been overlooked suddenly resulting in detention assignments or academic probation. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who taught AP Psychology, had attempted to address these systemic failures through the faculty senate, proposing enhanced anti-bullying measures and improved oversight of anonymous reporting procedures. Her proposals had been consistently tabled due to budget constraints and administrative workload concerns. Despite requiring minimal financial investment, and primarily involving policy clarification rather than new program implementation. When she'd persisted in raising these issues, her classroom observations had become more frequent and critical, with suggestions that her teaching methods might be contributing to student stress rather than providing the supportive environment psychology students required. The sophistication of the retaliation system had impressed Jessica in the most troubling way possible. Tyler's group had clearly studied the school's disciplinary procedures and had developed countermeasures for every potential threat to their operation. They'd learned to frame their harassment in language that mimicked official conflict resolution terminology, describing their money collection as voluntary team spirit contributions, and their intimidation tactics as peer mentoring designed to help struggling students develop resilience and social skills. Jessica's military experience had taught her to recognize enemy tactics and adapt accordingly, but the complexity of this particular adversary exceeded anything she'd encountered in combat zones. Tyler and his accomplices had weaponized the very systems designed to protect students, turning administrative procedures into tools of oppression, while maintaining the appearance of compliance with school policies and state regulations governing educational environments. The realization that she was facing an established network rather than a few troublemaking teenagers fundamentally changed Jessica's approach to the situation. Her military training had emphasized the importance of intelligence gathering and strategic planning when confronting organized opposition, and Emma's documentation provided the foundation for understanding how this particular enemy operated. The question now was whether the institutional corruption extended beyond willful blindness to active collaboration, and how many adults were involved in maintaining a system that sacrificed vulnerable students to protect athletic program revenue and administrative convenience. Jessica Martinez spent that evening in her small downtown apartment reviewing Emma's documentation, while cross-referencing it with her own observations from 3 weeks of teaching at Riverside High. Her military training had taught her to approach complex problems systematically, identifying enemy capabilities, assessing available resources, and developing multiple operational scenarios before committing to any course of action. What she discovered as she analyzed the evidence convinced her that conventional approaches through official channels would not only fail but would likely make the situation worse for the students being victimized. The sophistication of Tyler's operation impressed her in ways that reminded her of insurgent networks she'd encountered overseas. The group had established multiple revenue streams, created redundant communication systems, and developed sophisticated counterintelligence measures that allowed them to operate openly while maintaining plausible deniability. Most importantly, they'd compromised the very institutions that should have been protecting their victims, turning school administrators and athletic staff into unwitting collaborators who provided cover for criminal activity disguised as teenage mischief. Her analysis revealed several critical vulnerabilities in Tyler's network that stemmed from the same arrogance that made their operation so effective. The group had grown comfortable operating without serious opposition, leading them to document their activities in ways that would provide devastating evidence if properly collected and preserved. Their text message threads, social media posts, and financial transactions created digital footprints that could be traced by someone with appropriate technical skills and legal authority to access such records. Jessica's background in explosive ordnance disposal had required extensive training in digital forensics and surveillance techniques, skills she'd never expected to use in civilian life. But that suddenly seemed remarkably relevant to her current situation. The Army had taught her to think like her adversaries, understanding their operational patterns well enough to predict their next moves and position herself to exploit their inevitable mistakes. Tyler's group was making those mistakes daily, confident that no adult at Riverside High possessed the knowledge or motivation to challenge their activities effectively. The decision to take direct action crystallized when Jessica discovered that Tyler's network had begun targeting military families whose parents were deployed overseas. Among Emma's recent notes was an account of harassment directed toward Amy Rodriguez, whose father was serving his second deployment in Syria, while her mother worked double shifts as a nurse to manage household expenses during his absence. The girl had been identified as an ideal target precisely because her family's circumstances made it unlikely that her parents would have time or energy to investigate problems at school. Amy had been approached during her first week as a sophomore, with Chad Sullivan explaining that students with deployed parents traditionally contributed to care packages for overseas troops as a way of showing school spirit and patriotic support. The $25 monthly contribution had been presented as voluntary, but Amy's refusal had resulted in her lunch being contaminated with cleaning solution and her gym clothes being soaked with urine on multiple occasions. When she'd finally agreed to pay, the amount had increased to $40 monthly, with Jake Morrison explaining that inflation affected patriotic contributions just like everything else. The targeting of military families represented a line that Tyler's group had crossed without understanding the significance of their decision. Jessica's loyalty to the military community ran deeper than her commitment to abstract principles of justice, and the realization that these predators were specifically victimizing children whose parents were serving overseas triggered a level of anger she hadn't experienced since her combat deployments. Her military training had prepared her to respond to such provocations with controlled aggression channeled through strategic thinking rather than emotional reaction. Jessica began developing what she privately labeled Operation Cleanup, drawing on counterinsurgency tactics she'd learned during her tours in Afghanistan. The mission would require intelligence gathering, evidence documentation, network mapping, and ultimately the systematic dismantling of Tyler's operation through coordinated strikes against multiple vulnerabilities simultaneously. Her advantage lay in the fact that Tyler's group had no idea they were facing someone with professional training in exactly these types of operations. The first phase would involve establishing reliable communication with Emma Chen and other potential student allies who could provide ongoing intelligence about Tyler's activities without exposing themselves to retaliation. Jessica's military experience had taught her the critical importance of human intelligence networks in gathering actionable information about enemy operations, and she recognized that students like Emma represented assets whose cooperation would be essential for operational success. Danny Rodriguez's position in the IT department made him a potentially valuable ally, particularly given his Navy background and apparent awareness of the systematic problems affecting student safety at Riverside High. Veterans often recognized each other through subtle cues that civilians missed, and Jessica had noticed Danny's reaction when she'd mentioned her Army service during their brief introduction in the faculty lounge. His access to school communication systems and computer networks could provide the technical capabilities necessary for documenting Tyler's digital footprint while maintaining operational security. Maria Santos represented another potential asset whose social work background and obvious frustration with administrative inaction suggested she might be willing to support unconventional approaches to protecting vulnerable students. Jessica's assessment of the counselor indicated someone who prioritized student welfare over institutional politics, making her a logical candidate for recruitment into a network focused on achieving results rather than following bureaucratic procedures that had proven ineffective. The operational timeline would need to account for Tyler's group's seasonal patterns, which appeared to intensify during football season when their status within the school hierarchy reached its peak. Playoff preparations were scheduled to begin within 2 weeks, providing a window during which the group would be most confident and least cautious about their activities. Jessica planned to use their overconfidence against them, gathering evidence while they operated at maximum visibility before striking when they were most vulnerable to exposure. Her military training had emphasized the importance of mission preparation that included multiple contingency plans for different scenarios that might develop during operations. Tyler's network included powerful adult allies whose responses to threats against their athletic programs were unpredictable, requiring Jessica to prepare for escalation that might extend beyond school boundaries into legal and political arenas, where her military background might become either an asset or a liability depending on how events unfolded. The stakes involved more than just protecting current victims from ongoing harassment. Jessica understood that allowing Tyler's operation to continue would mean future students would face the same systematic abuse that had driven others to transfer schools or abandon educational opportunities they'd earned through academic achievement. Her decision to intervene represented a commitment to breaking cycles of institutional failure that had persisted for years while adults looked the other way, or actively enabled predatory behavior disguised as school tradition. Jessica closed Emma's notebook and began drafting operational plans that would transform her from passive observer to active threat against an enemy that had grown comfortable operating without opposition. Her military service had prepared her for exactly this type of mission, and Tyler Brennan was about to discover that some people fought back harder than others. The morning of the confrontation began like any other Tuesday at Riverside High, with Jessica arriving at 6:30 to prepare for her first period classes. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for maintenance vehicles and a few early arriving faculty members who preferred the quiet hours before students descended on the campus. Jessica had developed a routine of using this time to review her lesson plans and mentally prepare for the day ahead. But that particular morning she noticed something unusual as she walked toward the main building. Tyler Brennan's lifted Chevrolet Silverado was parked in the student lot despite school policy prohibiting student vehicles on campus before 7:15. The truck's diesel engine was running, and she could see multiple figures inside through the tinted windows. Jessica's military instincts triggered immediately, recognizing the vehicle's positioning as tactically significant, blocking clear sightlines from the main building while providing multiple escape routes through different parking lot exits. Her suspicions proved justified when she returned to her Jeep after forgetting her gradebook. Tyler, Jake Morrison, and Chad Sullivan had positioned themselves around her vehicle, with Tyler examining her keychain while his accomplices served as lookouts. The scene unfolded with the casual confidence of practiced criminals who'd never faced serious opposition, their body language relaxed and their conversation audible as they discussed her vehicle's resale value and debated whether stealing it outright was worth the additional legal risks compared to their usual protection racket operations. Jessica approached from their blind spot, using skills learned during urban combat training to move silently across the asphalt while maintaining situational awareness of potential additional threats. Her military experience had taught her to assess multiple variables simultaneously, noting escape routes, potential weapons, witness positions, and communication opportunities, while formulating tactical responses to different scenarios that might develop based on the subject's reactions to her presence. Tyler was explaining to his accomplices that taking the new teacher's vehicle would send a powerful message to the entire faculty about what happened to people who tried to interfere with their established operations. He'd apparently decided that Jessica's military background and her obvious discomfort with their classroom behavior made her a threat that required more dramatic intervention than their usual harassment techniques. The plan, as Jessica overheard it, involved taking her keys and demanding $500 for their return, with the amount doubling each day until payment was received. Jake Morrison was expressing concerns about escalating from student targets to faculty victims, worried that stealing from a teacher might trigger responses they hadn't faced when limiting their activities to vulnerable teenagers. His objections revealed interesting intelligence about the group's operational parameters and their understanding of administrative protection that apparently extended to covering up student victimization but might not shield them from crimes against adult employees. Chad Sullivan's role appeared to be providing muscle for operations that required physical intimidation, and his comments suggested he'd researched Jessica's military service through social media and public records. His assessment of her combat experience was both accurate and dismissive, reflecting the common civilian misconception that military training became irrelevant outside of war zones, and that female veterans posed minimal physical threats to athletic male teenagers who outweighed them by 50 pounds or more. Jessica allowed them to continue their discussion long enough to gather intelligence about their operational methods and confirm their criminal intent before announcing her presence. Her approach had been deliberately planned to occur when their attention was focused on her vehicle rather than their surroundings, positioning herself where she could control the tactical situation while documenting their criminal activity through her smartphone's video recording capability. Tyler's reaction to her arrival confirmed his guilt, while demonstrating the arrogance that had allowed his network to operate successfully for years without serious opposition. Instead of showing surprise or attempting to fabricate innocent explanations for their presence around her vehicle, he immediately shifted into intimidation mode, apparently assuming that a female teacher would be easily controlled through verbal aggression and implied physical threats. His opening statement involved herself to address additional threats from his accomplices, using techniques specifically designed for multiple opponent scenarios. The sweep technique Jessica used to drop Jake demonstrated another military skill that civilian bullies were unprepared to counter, sending him crashing into the side of her Jeep with enough force to crack his ribs while ensuring he remained conscious and aware of his extremely vulnerable position. Chad Sullivan's immediate decision to retreat rather than continue the assault revealed his accurate assessment of the tactical situation and his understanding that Jessica possessed capabilities none of them had anticipated. Tyler's submission came when Jessica explained calmly that she could increase pressure on his trapped arm until bones began breaking, a capability she demonstrated during training exercises, but had hoped never to use against American teenagers who should have been focused on education rather than criminal enterprises. His recognition that she possessed both the knowledge and willingness to cause permanent injury finally overcame the arrogance that had driven his harassment network for years. The aftermath of the confrontation unfolded rapidly as other faculty members arrived for work, and discovered Tyler Brennan on his knees beside Jessica's vehicle while Jake Morrison struggled to breathe properly after connecting with reinforced military vehicle construction. Jessica's video evidence provided irrefutable documentation of attempted theft and assault, creating legal problems that even Coach Patterson's influence couldn't minimize or eliminate through administrative manipulation. Principal Wilson's initial response followed predictable patterns as he attempted to frame the incident as a misunderstanding that could be resolved through mediation rather than legal action. His suggestion that charges should be dropped in exchange for Tyler's commitment to avoid future conflicts revealed the same institutional bias that had protected the harassment network for years while sacrificing victim welfare to preserve athletic program reputation. Jessica's military experience had taught her to recognize administrative incompetence and corruption, and Wilson's obvious intent to protect Tyler despite clear evidence of criminal behavior confirmed her assessment that conventional approaches through school channels would fail completely. Her decision to contact law enforcement directly bypassed administrative interference while establishing official records that couldn't be buried or minimized through internal school politics. Officer Amanda Price's response to Jessica's call demonstrated the difference between institutional protection of privileged students and professional law enforcement evaluation of criminal evidence. The patrol officer's review of Jessica's video documentation led to immediate arrests and formal charges that reflected the seriousness of attempted theft and assault rather than the minor disciplinary issues Wilson had tried to minimize. Tyler's arrest and handcuffs while being escorted from campus created the first public accountability he'd faced for years of criminal behavior, shocking students who'd witnessed his apparent immunity from consequences, despite numerous complaints about harassment and intimidation. The sight of their seemingly untouchable tormentor being loaded into a police cruiser sent ripples throughout the student body that fundamentally altered the power dynamics Tyler's network had carefully maintained. Jake Morrison's hospitalization for rib injuries provided additional evidence of the physical confrontation while generating medical documentation that supported assault charges against all three conspirators. His parents' threats to sue Jessica for excessive force collapsed when their attorney reviewed video evidence showing Jake's decision to attack a teacher who was already restraining another student for attempted theft. Chad Sullivan's cooperation with law enforcement investigations represented the beginning of the network's complete collapse, as he provided detailed information about years of harassment, extortion, and theft in exchange for reduced charges. His testimony revealed the full scope of Tyler's operation while implicating adult administrators whose knowledge of criminal activity made them accessories to ongoing crimes against students. Coach Patterson's downfall accelerated when investigators discovered his role in protecting Tyler from consequences while actively suppressing complaints from victims. Email records retrieved from school servers showed deliberate coordination between Patterson and administrators to minimize reports of harassment while maintaining federal funding that required diverse and safe educational environments for all students. The financial audit triggered by criminal investigations revealed systematic misappropriation of resources intended for student welfare programs, with athletic department budgets inflated through fraudulent accounting, while counseling and safety initiatives were defunded to maximize coaching salaries and equipment purchases. Patterson's personal use of school credit cards for restaurant meals and equipment that never reached student programs provided additional criminal charges that ended his career permanently. Principal Wilson's resignation came when school board members realized that federal investigations would examine every administrative decision made during his tenure, potentially exposing corruption that extended far beyond Tyler's harassment network. His departure created opportunities for genuine reform that previous complaints had never achieved, despite years of documented problems with student safety and administrative accountability. The ripple effects throughout Riverside High's community exceeded anything Jessica had anticipated when she'd first decided to intervene in Tyler's criminal enterprise. Parents who'd dismissed previous complaints as teenage drama suddenly recognized their failure to protect vulnerable students, leading to demands for transparency and accountability that administrators could no longer deflect or ignore. Emma Chen's role in documenting harassment evidence earned her recognition as a hero among students who'd suffered in silence while adults failed to provide protection or justice. Her courage in approaching Jessica with accumulated evidence had triggered changes that transformed the school's culture from protecting bullies to supporting their victims. Maria Santos's promotion to interim principal reflected the school board's recognition that genuine reform required leadership from someone who prioritized student welfare over athletic program politics. Her social work background and documented advocacy for vulnerable students made her the logical choice for implementing systematic changes that would prevent future abuse. Danny Rodriguez's technical expertise proved invaluable during investigations that uncovered years of deleted emails and manipulated records designed to hide administrative knowledge of ongoing harassment. His Navy background and understanding of institutional accountability helped investigators piece together evidence that implicated numerous adults in systematic failure to protect students. The federal investigation expanded beyond Riverside High when patterns of abuse and cover-ups were discovered at other schools throughout the district, revealing coordination between administrators to protect student-athletes regardless of their criminal behavior. The systematic nature of the corruption attracted attention from state education officials who implemented oversight measures designed to prevent similar situations. Tyler Brennan's conviction on multiple felony charges ended his athletic career and college prospects, while establishing legal precedents that strengthened protections for harassment victims throughout Oregon's educational system. His sentencing hearing included testimony from numerous students whose lives had been damaged by his network's activities, providing closure for victims who'd never expected to see justice. The civil lawsuits filed by harassment victims resulted in substantial financial settlements that funded comprehensive anti-bullying programs while compensating students for educational opportunities they'd lost due to administrative failure to provide safe learning environments. The legal precedents established through these cases made it much more difficult for future administrators to ignore harassment complaints. Jessica's decision to remain at Riverside High, despite offers from other districts, demonstrated her commitment to the students she'd sworn to protect when she'd first chosen teaching as her civilian career. Her military background had prepared her for combat against external enemies, but the fight against institutional corruption had proven equally important for protecting innocent people who couldn't defend themselves. The physical education program Jessica developed emphasized conflict resolution and personal safety skills, alongside traditional athletic instruction, teaching students to recognize manipulation tactics and respond effectively to harassment. Her military experience provided unique insights into leadership and teamwork that helped students develop confidence and resilience in ways that complemented their academic education. The Memorial Scholarship, established in honor of students who'd suffered harassment, created positive outcomes from a tragedy that had affected numerous families throughout the community. The fund provided educational opportunities for victims while ensuring that Tyler's crimes would be remembered as a catalyst for positive change rather than simply a period of institutional failure. Emma Chen's admission to Stanford University with a full scholarship reflected her academic achievements and her courage in confronting systematic abuse that adults had failed to address. Her example inspired other students to speak up about problems they observed, creating a culture of accountability that prevented future harassment networks from establishing operations. The documentary produced about the Riverside High scandal attracted national attention to problems of athletic privilege and administrative corruption that existed throughout American educational systems. Jessica's story became a symbol of how individual courage could trigger systematic change when institutions failed to protect vulnerable people. Amy Rodriguez's recovery from harassment trauma demonstrated the healing that became possible when victims received appropriate support rather than being blamed for the abuse they'd suffered. Her father's return from deployment coincided with Tyler's conviction, allowing their family to rebuild while knowing that his sacrifice overseas had been honored by justice at home. Marcus Webb's transfer back to Riverside High after Tyler's arrest allowed him to complete his education in an environment where his academic achievements were celebrated rather than punished. His graduation as valedictorian represented the triumph of genuine excellence over the false superiority that Tyler's network had tried to establish through intimidation. The new anti-harassment policies implemented throughout the district included mandatory reporting requirements that eliminated administrative discretion in handling complaints, ensuring that future victims would receive immediate protection rather than bureaucratic delays designed to protect perpetrators. The reforms attracted positive attention from education policy experts who recommended similar measures nationally. Jessica's promotion to athletic director reflected the community's recognition that genuine leadership required moral courage rather than just administrative experience. Her military background and demonstrated commitment to protecting students made her uniquely qualified to ensure that athletic programs served educational purposes rather than enabling abuse. The 10-year reunion of Jessica's first graduating class included testimony from students whose lives had been transformed by her intervention in Tyler's harassment network. Their success stories demonstrated the long-term impact of protecting vulnerable young people during critical periods of their educational development. Tyler's release from prison after serving 3 years of his sentence occurred without fanfare, as the community had moved forward with implementing reforms that made his type of harassment network impossible to re-establish. His attempts to return to Millbrook were unsuccessful, as local employers and residents had no interest in associating with someone whose crimes had damaged so many families. The legislative changes inspired by the Riverside High case included stronger protections for whistleblowers and mandatory criminal background checks for all school employees, creating systematic safeguards that extended far beyond the original community where Jessica had first confronted institutional corruption. Coach Patterson's conviction on federal charges of defrauding educational programs resulted in a lengthy prison sentence that reflected the seriousness of betraying public trust while drawing a government salary. His case established precedents that made it much more difficult for future administrators to claim ignorance of harassment occurring under their supervision. The academic improvement at Riverside High following the elimination of harassment networks demonstrated the connection between student safety and educational achievement, with test scores and graduation rates reaching record levels once students could focus on learning rather than avoiding predators. Maria Santos's permanent appointment as principal came with overwhelming community support that reflected her success in transforming the school's culture from protecting bullies to empowering victims. Her leadership style emphasized transparency and accountability in ways that prevented the kind of corruption that had enabled Tyler's network. The Courage Awards, established in Jessica's honor, recognized students and faculty members who demonstrated moral bravery in confronting injustice, creating positive incentives for the kind of intervention that had been absent when Tyler's harassment network was establishing its operations. The 5-year follow-up study of harassment prevention programs implemented after the Riverside scandal showed dramatic reductions in bullying incidents throughout participating school districts, validating the systematic reforms that had emerged from Jessica's initial decision to fight back against institutional failure. Danny Rodriguez's appointment as District Technology Director reflected his expertise in digital forensics and his commitment to using technical capabilities for protecting students rather than covering up administrative failures. His innovations in monitoring communications helped identify potential harassment before it could escalate to criminal levels. The scholarship recipients who benefited from legal settlements achieved remarkable academic success that honored the memory of students whose educational opportunities had been damaged by systematic harassment. Their achievements demonstrated the positive potential that could be unlocked when vulnerable young people received appropriate protection and support. Jessica's marriage to a fellow veteran and their decision to raise their family in Millbrook reflected the community transformation that had occurred following the exposure of corruption and implementation of genuine reforms. Their children would attend schools where safety and learning were prioritized over athletic revenue and administrative convenience. The textbook cases based on the Riverside scandal became standard teaching materials in education administration programs, ensuring that future school leaders understood the legal and moral obligations involved in protecting students from harassment. Jessica's example demonstrated the importance of moral courage in institutional leadership. The continuing friendship between Jessica and Emma represented the bond forged between a veteran and a student who'd both demonstrated exceptional courage in confronting powerful people who'd abused their authority. Their relationship of protecting vulnerable young people during critical periods of their educational development. Tyler's release from prison after serving 3 years of his sentence occurred without fanfare, as the community had moved forward with implementing reforms that made his type of harassment network impossible to re-establish. His attempts to return to Millbrook were unsuccessful, as local employers and residents had no interest in associating with someone whose crimes had damaged so many families. The legislative changes inspired by the Riverside High case included stronger protections for whistleblowers and mandatory criminal background checks for all school employees, creating systematic safeguards that extended far beyond the original community where Jessica had first confronted institutional corruption. Coach Patterson's conviction on federal charges of defrauding educational programs resulted in a lengthy prison sentence that reflected the seriousness of betraying public trust while drawing a government salary. His case established precedents that made it much more difficult for future administrators to claim ignorance of harassment occurring under their supervision. The academic improvement at Riverside High following the elimination of harassment networks demonstrated the connection between student safety and educational achievement, with test scores and graduation rates reaching record levels once students could focus on learning rather than avoiding predators. Maria Santos's permanent appointment as principal came with overwhelming community support that reflected her success in transforming the school's culture from protecting bullies to empowering victims. Her leadership style emphasized transparency and accountability in ways that prevented the kind of corruption that had enabled Tyler's network. The Courage Awards, established in Jessica's honor, recognized students and faculty members who demonstrated moral bravery in confronting injustice, creating positive incentives for the kind of intervention that had been absent when Tyler's harassment network was establishing its operations. The 5-year follow-up study of harassment prevention programs implemented after the Riverside scandal showed dramatic reductions in bullying incidents throughout participating school districts, validating the systematic reforms that had emerged from Jessica's initial decision to fight back against institutional failure. Danny Rodriguez's appointment as District Technology Director reflected his expertise in digital forensics and his commitment to using technical capabilities for protecting students rather than covering up administrative failures. His innovations in monitoring communications helped identify potential harassment before it could escalate to criminal levels. The scholarship recipients who benefited from legal settlements achieved remarkable academic success that honored the memory of students whose educational opportunities had been damaged by systematic harassment. Their achievements demonstrated the positive potential that could be unlocked when vulnerable young people received appropriate protection and support. Jessica's marriage to a fellow veteran and their decision to raise their family in Millbrook reflected the community transformation that had occurred following the exposure of corruption and implementation of genuine reforms. Their children would attend schools where safety and learning were prioritized over athletic revenue and administrative convenience. The textbook cases based on the Riverside scandal became standard teaching materials in education administration programs, ensuring that future school leaders understood the legal and moral obligations involved in protecting students from harassment. Jessica's example demonstrated the importance of moral courage in institutional leadership. The continuing friendship between Jessica and Emma represented the bond forged between a veteran and a student who'd both demonstrated exceptional courage in confronting powerful people who'd abused their authority. Their relationship symbolized the positive outcomes possible when adults fulfilled their responsibilities to protect young people. The 20-year commemoration of Tyler's arrest included a community celebration of the systematic changes that had transformed Riverside High from a place where bullies prospered to an institution where all students could pursue their educational goals safely. The memorial honored victims while celebrating survivors and the adults who'd finally provided protection. The retirement ceremony, when Jessica concluded her career at Riverside High, drew attendees from across the country, including former students whose lives had been saved by her intervention and education policy experts, who credited her courage with inspiring nationwide reforms. Her legacy extended far beyond one confrontation in a parking lot to encompass systematic changes that protected countless vulnerable students. As the sun set on Jessica's final day at Riverside High, she reflected on how a single decision to fight back against institutional corruption had transformed not just her own life, but an entire community's approach to protecting its most vulnerable members. The military training that had prepared her for combat overseas had proven equally valuable for fighting domestic enemies who preyed on children while hiding behind institutional authority. The empty parking lot where she'd first confronted Tyler Brennan now symbolized the safety that all students deserved rather than the hunting ground it had once represented for predators who'd operated without fear of consequences. The changes she'd helped implement would protect future generations of students whose potential might otherwise have been crushed by systematic harassment enabled by adult failure. Her legacy lived on in the policies, programs, and cultural transformation that ensured no future Tyler Brennan could establish the kind of criminal enterprise that had once terrorized vulnerable students while enriching corrupt administrators. The courage she demonstrated in a moment of crisis had inspired systematic reforms that would protect students for decades to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.